Hello and welcome to Healing for the Heart's podcast, People Just Like Us, where we have folks who guest on here who are really just like us. That's the whole prerequisite for being part of this podcast. I am really delighted today to have Hazel Long joining us on the podcast, and we're going to talk on a kind of different subject, I suppose, to the kind of subject that we usually talk on. And you're going to see how it's all interrelated to mental health as well. So, Hazel, it's lovely to have you with us. Why don't you introduce yourself a wee bit and tell folk what it is you do?
Thank you so much for having me, Shona. So hello, everyone. My name's Hazel Long. I am a registered nutritionist, so I come from a nutrition science background. I specialised in public health, and for the past 8 years, I've been working in public health in both local government and the NHS. So I've got quite varied experience working with different population groups. And I've recently just about 8 weeks ago left employment with the NHS to start my own freelance practice, which is, again, it's quite varied, but it's essentially focusing on making evidence-based nutrition accessible to everyone. So I know we have a world where we have this abundance of information, often aggressive messages, often conflicting information. And my goal is to work with lots of different people, from education settings to corporate organisations to third sector, to make evidence-based nutrition more accessible. I also do nutrition writing, and I also guest lecture.
Fabulous. That's almost a whole CV in there. It might be helpful for some folks who are listening to just understand the whole idea of what nutrition is and what evidence-based nutrition is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, most people will be familiar that when we talk about nutrition, we're talking about what we eat and why we eat. There's lots of reasons and there's lots of drivers behind why we eat. It's not just health related. But when it comes to evidence-based nutrition, we look at the science. So we look at research on a population level. That gives us an indication in terms of what foods are important and for what reason. And that allows us to give population level recommendations based on long-term disease risk. And we use data that spans kind of from decades back right up until today. And then you have other aspects of nutrition that looks at specific disease risk. And it may be people with certain medical conditions are advised to do things that are slightly different. But that always needs to be driven by the science and the available literature. And that's why it's really good for us as nutrition professionals to just make people aware of the regulations that we are required to adhere to, because in the UK, nutritionist is not a protected title, so anybody could use that term. You could start your own nutrition business tomorrow if you want to, and nobody would stop you. And as a result of that, people can sometimes be a bit confused and unsure as to who to trust. But registered nutritionists have a minimum of a degree, and they will have studied nutrition science in the context of human physiology, so the human body, so how certain nutrients impact different organ systems, etc. And then they're also regulated. They do a 3-year specialism following on from university, and we have to demonstrate a commitment to learn. So we do an additional 30 hours of CPD each year. And then you have registered dietitians who also have a degree, but they are more clinical in terms of the work that they do. So they will work in a hospital setting, usually with patients with specific medical conditions. And that's the only legally protected nutrition title in the UK. So that's a bit of a background to our profession.
Okay, so really, I guess what you're talking about is the things that you do, the role that you have is to look at what we eat and how that can keep us healthy.
Yep.
Really, in a nutshell, whether that's physical health or emotional health or mental health or whatever that looks like. So obviously, we're a mental health charity, and we talk about mental health on the podcast here. So can you give us a bit of an idea of your experience, maybe professionally, maybe personally, in terms of mental health?
Yeah, I'm 34. So when I was at school, it wasn't something that was really spoken about. I don't think I was familiar with the term mental health when I was at school. And I think when I was younger, there was probably a lot of stigmatizing language that was used around mental health, which meant people probably didn't talk about it in the way that they talk about it now. And I think, from a personal level, I do think growing up, I did experience certain things relating to mental health that now when I look back on it and I think, oh, I would have probably really benefited from speaking to somebody then. For me, particularly things around body image in the teenage years, which we know is really common, and also just this kind of pressure to perform and this pressure to achieve. And I had quite a big fear of failure. And I put a lot of pressure on myself during my early university years to really perform. And that had an impact on other areas of my life. So from a personal perspective, when I look back at that, I think, I probably would have benefited. And I often think, oh, I wish I could give that younger version of me a hug. And I think lots of people who are sort of my generation and older probably think like that because nobody ever spoke about it. And there was a stigma around conversations around mental health. So I think it's probably quite common for people of my generation to look back and think, I wish I'd spoken to somebody, or I wish we spoke about that. From a professional perspective, I've worked in public health for about 8 years. My most recent role in the NHS, I sat within the public health department. And although my work stream wasn't mental health, I did work with third sector organisations, and I did work with people around encouraging vulnerable groups to make small dietary changes. We supported vulnerable groups in terms of learning more about food, in terms of cooking, in terms of reading food labels, in terms of food waste, and mental health did sometimes come into the work that we were doing around that. And there was a lot of work that was done around kind of food and mood and encouraging people to kind of see this connection between how we eat and then how we feel day to day. Because often when we think about food, people often think about sort of long-term disease risk. Like most people will be familiar around messages around food and things like heart disease and type 2 diabetes, but we often don't necessarily think that the choices that we make day in, day out can have an impact on how we feel, on how we sleep, on our energy levels, which can then have an impact on whether or not we choose to go for that walk or whether or not we choose to go and meet a friend. So there's kind of different ways in which it can affect us.
I suppose that food and mood thing has actually started to become something that people are really interested in, and how what we take into our bodies actually doesn't just impact our bodies, but impacts our whole sense of well-being as well then.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that we can talk about sort of mechanism of action, and that we know that there's certain nutrients that are important for the production of serotonin, which is our happy hormone. And again, we know that there's certain nutrients that are involved in the production of melatonin, which is the hormone that helps us to sleep. And that's going to have an impact on how we feel. Anyone that's ever been sleep deprived, had a baby, or been jet lagged knows that if you're not sleeping well, that has a huge impact on how you feel day to day, your mental well-being. And then, we are starting to see more research that's looking at the role of our diet in terms of certain mental health disorders. And although I would actively encourage anybody that thinks that they have a mental health disorder to speak to a GP, to speak to an appropriately qualified mental health professional, we should be encouraging everybody to eat well. And I think we'll probably see more research coming out in that field over the next sort of 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, there's definitely something in there, isn't there? I was even thinking when you were speaking there about young people and nutrition as well, because so I have 2 adult children. They're not really children, but you know what I mean. And so for both of them, I listen to them, in particular one of them who kind of would happily live on McDonald's and KFC. And that thing of it, and he's absolutely fine on it, and doesn't seem to have any adverse effects. And I remember a GP saying to him years ago, you'll be fine until you hit 30, and then your body will start to complain about it. But I suppose even for young people, it's how we encourage that, how we encourage them to develop those healthy habits, I suppose, that's going to support them in the long term, and not just like over the next 18 months or something as well.
And I think a big part of that is connection to your body. It's
Yeah.
actually taking the time, which gets really difficult in our modern world because we're all so busy. We've all got these really chaotic lifestyles that we're juggling so many different things, and there's lots of pressure on young people. And actually, it is about connecting to your body. And I guess you could say the same with alcohol. So I don't drink any at all, and it's just because I don't like the way that it makes me feel. But then when I reflect on doing things like nights out and stuff when I was at university, it didn't make me feel the same way as it makes me feel now that I am in my 30s. I've got 2 young children. It just doesn't make me feel good. And by connecting with your body, you can then make choices,
Yeah.
and kind of think about your future self. How are you going to feel tomorrow if you make this choice now? And I
Yeah.
think it can be quite difficult with things like food because it might make you feel great in the moment, but then it might not make you feel good the next day. And then it's also not black and white because our reasons for eating are different. And actually, we eat for social reasons and it allows us to connect with people. So it's not saying you can never have the burger or you can never have a slice of cake with a friend. It's just kind of getting that balance right. And I know that the term balance isn't particularly exciting, but that's really what we want to find. We want to find our own individual balance that honors our health, but also allows us to use food for other things as well, like connecting with other people.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And in all of that, then I would imagine as you work with people in terms of their nutrition, and you're seeing all of these things that the nutrition and the issues with nutrition spreads out into lots of other areas of life. Then, what
Mhm.
are the kind of challenges you're seeing with people just now, or what kind of challenges have you seen with people in terms of that connection between nutrition and mental health?
Well, I think probably it's fair to say the biggest challenge that we have at the moment is the cost of living crisis. So
Yeah,
last year we saw the biggest increase in food prices in 45 years. It was over 19%. And that actually affects everybody, but it's going to disproportionately affect the most vulnerable people. So people who are living in poverty, people who are disabled, potentially people who maybe have um, 0-hour contracts and they don't have that regular income, potentially people who have big families as well. So that is a huge issue. And we have seen there is data to say that there has been a shift in terms of fruit and vegetable purchasing because we know that these foods can be expensive. And we also have to think about if somebody has a small budget and they're feeding a family, they don't want waste. So
yeah,
they're going to make choices for things that they maybe know that their children are going to eat. And that
yeah,
may mean that they don't have as much of a varied diet. And we see differences in terms of markers of health in young children. We see if we look at national data of children at the point in which they start school, so around about age 5, we see a 2.5 times different in terms of dental tooth decay between children from the most deprived areas versus the least deprived areas. We also see differences in childhood obesity, significant ones. And then, as I know that you are aware of, poverty is a big driver of poor mental health. And that's a two-way relationship, isn't it? Poverty can cause poor mental health, but poor mental health can also
yeah,
affect people's ability to stay in employment. So that is a huge challenge. And it is a political challenge. And obviously we have a new government and we are all hoping to see some big changes. So that is probably the main challenge, I think, on a population level. I do think that we have, as nutrition professionals, a challenge with misinformation. Um, we see a lot of aggressive messaging around food, and with the rise in social media, which is not regulated at all, we see a lot of big accounts putting out information that's not accurate and that makes the public feel confused. And if we look at the research, we know that some of these big platforms, the likes of Instagram, TikTok, a lot of the nutrition information on these platforms is not accurate. Yet more and more people, particularly young people, are using these platforms for nutrition advice. So I would say there are two big problems that we have at the moment: misinformation and obviously the impact of the cost of living crisis.
I think that the cost of living crisis thing's really interesting, and that whole impact of poverty thing is something that comes up on a really regular basis when we have conversations on these podcasts, and just the overarching impact that poverty has on people's well-being. You don't even need to put mental health in there, just well-being in general, and that whole idea that poverty comes in many shapes and forms, and it's not just about financial poverty,
Yep.
but it certainly, as far as financial poverty is concerned, having access to good quality, healthy food
Mm-hmm.
is very, very difficult. I was chatting with somebody about this just the other week, and how you can go in and buy, ready-made meals that are like, £1 a portion or whatever they are, or even less than that, which is entirely doable. But then you try to buy, even buying vegetables for soup, your
Mm-hmm.
price per portion is soaring because the fresh fruit and veg is so expensive. And it's that whole thing of, well, how do you encourage people? How do you encourage people to do that? If they don't have the money, they've got to have a choice to feed their family in some way, shape, or form. And actually, the choice to do it in a healthy way is often removed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think that on a sort of general population level, people don't fully understand the challenges because anecdotally, I've heard people say things like, well, Aldi and Lidl, cheaper supermarkets, but we still have over 1 million households in the UK that live in food deserts, and these are essentially areas where people do not have large supermarkets
Yeah,
in walking distance, or
yeah,
in a way that they can access them in a reasonable amount of time. And
yeah,
they may have to either have a car, which not everyone has, or they may rely on public transport. And we know that a lot of these rural communities often have higher levels of deprivation alongside poor public transport. So there are these barriers which, again, are political, but in my time working in public health, I did work in lots of these areas, and they are relying on these small shops in which one that I actually went into one day because I was peckish and I wanted a piece of fruit. And I went into the shop and I had to walk right to the back to access the fruit. And it was something like £3 for 4 pears. And right at the front of the shop, there's huge amounts of options of buying multi-packs of chocolate bars, biscuits, crisps, all of these things for a fraction of the price. So you can see why, if you're somebody that's struggling with
yeah,
money and you've got a family to feed and you
yeah,
want to guarantee that your child's going to have it, you can see why you would make a different
yeah,
choice. So the things that we think are quite intuitive, like go to Aldi and buy things like chickpeas or whatever, that's not actually a choice that everyone has. And then you have the cost of electricity as well, because we know that
yeah,
those prices have
yeah,
changed as well. So
yeah,
not everyone will necessarily have the same opportunities to prepare food at home.
yeah.
So it's definitely a complex and layered topic. And that's why
Yeah.
it's so important that we remove shame and judgment when it comes to the language that we use around food.
Yep. And I suppose that whole thing too of there isn't one easy answer. But you're so what you were saying about misinformation and social media and whatnot, that's a massive thing as well in there, because there isn't one answer to this problem. But if you, depending on which area of social media you read, it would be suggested that there is one answer to this problem. If you just do this, then this will happen. But it's much, much more complex than that.
Yeah, and one thing that I do think, I did write an article on this not long ago, and it was about social media. And I was pulling from the research that was essentially saying a lot of these solutions to health that are being promoted are not evidence based, but they also completely ignore poverty from the conversation. And there is no solution to health if we don't address poverty. So if you develop these products, these supplements, these gadgets, even if they did work, if they're really expensive, then that's not going to solve all of the issues that we see in terms of today's society, in terms of the statistics around certain diseases, etc. Because poverty is the big driver of that. So we
Yeah.
have to be very critical. And I actually do think that teaching young people about the social model of health may help them think critically in terms of the sort of aggressive marketing that they are going to be exposed to.
Yep. And just so that we all understand the social. Can you explain the social model of health for us?
Yeah, I mean, often when we think about health, people think about kind of individual behaviors like diet,
Yep.
physical activity, but the social model of health really draws around these other factors, including our environment, our education level, employment, housing, and really highlights that all of these things have a direct impact on our health as well. And I guess if we used employment as an example of that, if you're somebody that is unemployed, you will have less money, which means you may have to make less healthy food choices. You may not be able to afford to join exercise classes. You may struggle with poor mental health, as we've already mentioned. Poverty can be a driver
Yep.
of poor mental health. So it's essentially that there are all these wider factors, which are often out with individuals' control, that have an impact on health.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we would be really quite big on here and quite vocal about here is that whole, we would see it from a mental health perspective, but somebody comes and they're really struggling with depression, and they're being medicated for depression and it's not getting any better. But then if you stop and you step back and then you look at what's going on round about them, and there's isolation and there's poverty and there's relationship difficulties or breakups or whatever, or there's grief because there's been death or there's been loss or whatever. When you look at all of these things round about it, it's not necessarily that the medication is going to make a difference on its own, because there are systemic things round about them that are influencing how they feel.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose it is that much bigger picture that people need to look at. It's not just about buying healthy food, and it's not just about getting enough sleep, because everything is all intertwined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So the question, as you know, that we always land on with people in this podcast is, if we gave you a magic wand, and I'm thinking I might even have a pitch at what you might say, but if we had this magic wand or fairy dust we could give you that you could wave or sprinkle that would change one thing in our society that would have a massive positive impact on mental health, perhaps from a nutrition perspective, then what would that be?
So I think I would address poverty. But that is such it's such a big topic, isn't it? I mean, I think we, without question, need a more equitable food system. It would really shift national statistics around all aspects of health if we could address poverty. I think on a kind of food perspective, legislation around the way in which food is priced, so that healthier food was the easy choice for everybody. It was accessible. Everybody knew what to do with it. I actually went to a talk on Wednesday, and this is probably quite a good example of maybe something that we can kind of leave thinking of is in the war. They obviously had to ration food, but as a result of this rationing program, they redistributed food, and it meant that people who were living in poverty actually had more access to things like fresh fruits and vegetables, meat, things that they maybe hadn't been able to afford before. And then the wealthier people were having less. So it kind of redistributed food. And the people in the UK kind of came out the other end of the war being healthier and fitter. And, if we could just kind of redistribute things so that we all had access to healthy, affordable food, that would have such a huge impact on just overall health. And everything is connected. So we do have this gut brain axis, but also things like, chronic diseases can have an impact on somebody's mental health. So there's so many ways in which they're interlinked. And if we could just get on top of, it's not even just poverty, it's the food system as a whole, like what we spoke about in terms of food deserts, and still people are living in environments where they just don't have access. That would be the thing that I would tackle first. And of course, I would want to do more around education and working with young people. But if we could just shift the environment, that would be my number one thing.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's almost about that whole equitable thing, but across the board. So it's not just about having the financial means to access. It's actually about all of this. It's
Hmm.
about the equity and the share of it, and where you can get it, and how you get it, and all the rest of it. So it's actually a much bigger picture. And for lots of these things, whether it's mental health or physical health or whatever, well-being, whatever we're talking about, I think there's something that comes up time and time again in these conversations about the fact that it's so much bigger than just one answer or one solution or one tweak here. There's actually a whole pile of things that are all interplaying and intermingling with one another to produce the system that we've got at the moment. I
Hmm.
think your war examples are a really interesting one, so you've got a whole set of different conditions there, and different conditions that people wouldn't want to live in and wouldn't live in by choice, but in actual fact, the health of the population was better.
Hmm. Yeah.
Interestingly,
Yeah. And I also think as well we are at a point where, we do need to really shift our food system to
yeah,
support our environment as well.
yeah,
And all of these things are interlinked. Like, how can we possibly tackle things like the impact of our food system on climate change when actually so many people just don't have the choice to even think about that? So
yeah,
all of these things are interlinked.
yeah,
Um, so, like you say, it's about just making everything more equitable and
yeah,
fairer system for everyone.
yeah. I wonder, I'm just going to put you on the spot here. That's usually the last question, but you've now prompted me to think about something else. So I'm just wondering, there'll be lots of people listening to this thinking, well, all the kind of policy stuff and the theoretical stuff is fine. That's really interesting. But what can I do in my little world when I am just now? What could I do that would make a difference to me? So what would that look like? If there was something that if there was a piece of advice that you could give anybody
Mhm.
listening to this just now in terms of how to improve their nutrition, that would then have a consequence in terms of improving their mental health and well-being. Can you think of anything that would be simple?
Yeah, well, I think probably one of the obvious things that we have in the UK, just based on national data, and I see this anecdotally, usually is the first thing that I spot if I'm speaking to people one to one or if I'm doing a dietary assessment, is that we're fiber deficient in the UK. We don't eat enough fiber. About 9% of people get enough fiber, and I know fiber is not super exciting, um, but we are fiber deficient, and we are learning more and more about the relationship between the gut and the brain. And fiber is brilliant for our gut. So fiber feeds the bacteria within our gut. So I would encourage people to think about, are you getting enough fiber? And if you're not, what small thing can you do to make a change? And it doesn't have to be huge. And there's lots of foods that contain fiber. There's fruits, there's vegetables, there's whole grains, there's beans, there's pulses, there's nuts, there's seeds. So it might be that small difference that you make as you swap to a slightly higher fiber bread or a higher fiber cereal. It might be that you start to think, am I getting enough fruits and vegetables? And if you are somebody that is struggling financially, maybe thinking of ways in which you can still get them in, but at a lower cost. So opting for things like tinned or frozen fruits and vegetables, things that have a longer shelf life, even just cheaper versions. So things like carrots are usually very cheap, making sure that you're buying things that are within your budget that aren't going to kind of go off the next day. So there's lots of little things that we can do. And when it comes to things like snacks, nuts are a brilliant thing to add in if you can get hold of them. So just looking at your overall diet and just finding what small things could I do to just slightly increase my fiber consumption. That's definitely going to be beneficial for an overall health perspective, and a gut health perspective.
Excellent. And that sounds like a really good place to leave it there.
Yep.
And that leaves, we like to leave people with practical advice as well. And so that leaves people with something that they can change. And maybe if people are listening to this and they go away and they have a shot and they decide that they're going to try and supplement or try and add some more fiber into their diet. But I was actually thinking when you were speaking, that's is that about having beans on toast instead of having cheese on toast at lunchtime, and it's like, so it's like dead simple things like that. It's not that you have to do something that's hugely complicated. And if people do that, then maybe they'll leave us a comment on our social media posts when this goes up, and so that we all learn from one another. So if somebody's found a really good way of increasing fibre in their diet, then they might want to leave that as a comment that would let other people think, oh, I could do that too.
Yeah, definitely. No, I would love to hear that. And that is the great thing about fiber. It's not about overhauling your diet and changing everything. It's just making simple swaps, adding things in. It's not centered in restriction. And we all have different taste preferences. So it's really doing what works for you.
Yep. And of course, we do know, as you say, the link between your gut health and your mental health and well-being as well, the gut-brain axis thing. That's well documented, and folks listening to this will probably have heard of that already. And so it would be interesting to see if, as a community listening to this, if people start to look at looking after their gut, how does that actually improve their mental health and well-being as well? And that would be a really interesting, even anecdotally, that would
Yeah.
be really interesting to hear from people too. Thank you so much for coming on. That was fascinating, and I'm sure folks will be really interested. We'll put your contact details on the blurb from this and on our social media posts, so that if people are wanting some more information, they can get in touch with you. If there are organisations who are looking to have your expertise come in to help them, then they'll be able to do that as well.